Hello my fellow fellows, I'm Horizon95 and welcome to the review from the perspective of a musician. Yabba-dibby-doo, insert funny joke here, insert laughter track here, you know the drill. In today's episode we'll be going over Vital, the Spectral Morphing Wavetable Synthesizer, which I believe is going to be one of the most groundbreaking and disruptive synthesizers out there. Let's not stop dilly-dallying and do all the doohickeys and whatnots. Let's get started, dive right in. Before we talk about Vital, we need to talk about Helm. Helm is a synth that was released fairly recently within the past few years, and it is known as one of the best free and open source synths out there, alongside wonderful synths such as Surge and Odin 2. But what makes Helm unique and more attractive to use compared to Surge and Odin 2 would be Helm's visual approach to pretty much everything. Everything is laid out in one single panel, so there's no window switching. There's 2 oscillators, up to 15 voices, unison, and there's a step sequencer, arpeggiator, a filter, and a small batch but good selection of effects. There's 3 envelopes and 3 LFOs, which offer some very nice visual feedback. This makes Helm an easy synth to understand what's going on and what is modulating what. It's a perfect beginner synth. However, I think Vital now takes that spot of perfect beginner synth. I'll explain why later on. Now, if you used Helm, you might have noticed the fact that the unison sounds different compared to synthesizers like Serum. You also might realize that there's no option for panning. These two things are a product of one of Helm's biggest shortcomings, which is the fact that Helm is mono. It's not in stereo. Which, while it's kind of a bummer, it still doesn't disqualify the synth from being in your collection. Now that I've finished explaining the background, let's get into the meat and potatoes of this review. Vital, the Spectral Morphing Wavetable Synthesizer. Let's do this. Alright, so this here is Vital. So what we're going to do is we're going to start from going to the bottom. We're going to go right, we're going to go up, through the top, and all the way around. So we're just going to go around the synth to everything that stays active always up front. And then we're going to go into these 4 different panels, and then we're going to go into some of the fun little stuff that's not necessarily shown right around here. So first things first, you'll have a look at the bottom here is you see a big fat keyboard. This will light up in purple. When you play notes, you can, in standalone, you can use Z and X to control the octaves. And you can also click on the keyboard to play notes. Over here on the left, you'll have your pitch and mod wheels. Very easy to control as you would in any other synth. You can also right-click on these to set to either their default value. You can learn their MIDI assignment, so you can control with a MIDI controller, or you can also enter a specific value. Most knobs have these options. So next up, we're going to go over here to the voices panel, which is what I'm going to call. Here you can control the amount of, you can control the voices, which is the amount of polyphony that the synth will have, so you can control it to a single note polyphony, so you can change it from all the way up from 1 all the way up to 32 by default. You can double click and it's back to 8. Bend controls the amount that the note will pitch bend by, so right now it's at 2 semitones. This has a minimum of 0 with a maximum of 48, so that's around, I think, 4 total octaves. Pretty powerful. This knob right here introduces velocity tracking. By default, it's set to 0, so every single note you play, no matter how hard you press, will be the exact same. You can turn it up to 100 to get normal velocity tracking, or you can turn it all the way to negative 100 to get negative velocity tracking. So I play soft, and it plays loud. I play loud, it plays soft. The spread knob controls the stereo spread of the synth, so this is more, I'll demonstrate it by cranking up the unison, so you can get that nice mono Helm sound, but by default it's set to 100. Over here you also have the rotate knob, which does some pretty interesting stuff, so I am going to enable a second oscillator, crank it down to an octave under. We're going to pan it separately, and then we're going to put an LFO on the rotate knob, so we can do this. Pretty cool. I'll initialize the patch here. Over here you have your glide function, which I will show you what it does through the spectrogram. So we can go from 0, which is instant. This I think is more pronounced with polyphony and legato set, so So we have single note polyphony. We can control all the way up to 16 seconds. We'll put it at 3. And slow bowl control the slope of the glide. Always glide will always glide, so if I hit a note here, and then I hit an octave higher, it will always glide depending on how much you set to glide, so it also controls the slope as well. Pretty cool. We'll set that back to 0. Octave scale does whatever that does. I have no idea what that does. So, next up, we're going to go into the random LFOs. So, there's a total of 4, and you will see that once I start assigning more, you will see the other LFOs appear. We'll double-click these to reset. By default, it shows you 2. This is just to save some space and clutter, which I think is really a cool thing. So, let's show you what this does. I'm going to open up a wavetable here. Let's open up an FM growl. So over here, what you can sync the random LFO to your host tempo. So whether that be standalone or it also sync to your DAW. So pretty cool. We can also split this into stereo, so you will hear 2 different modulations that are completely separate from each other, which I think is pretty cool with Vital. So as you'll hear 2 different signal paths, which is split the random LFO into stereo. That you can also do this with the regular LFOs, which I'll demonstrate in a bit. You also have 4 different types of randomness. So you have purl and noise. You have sample and hold. You can definitely hear that stereo modulation. You have the LFO view, which shows you what state the LFO is in. You also have sign interpolate. And you also have Lawrence tractor. That's pretty cool. We'll go to sample and hold again. So this is the frequency. You can change it from tempo to dotted tempo, to triplets as well. That's not triplets, that's triplets. You can also change it to seconds. So you can make it go stupid fast. And you can basically make it go stupidly slow. So up to 2 minutes. By default, set to half a second. You can also key track it. Which is pretty cool. We'll set that back to tempo, and I'll disable that stuff, and we'll remove the oscillator waveframe. Next up, we'll move on to the other modulation sources. You have note, which will modulate whatever depending on what note you're playing. So, and I'm actually going to turn off note tracking for this. Pretty cool. Next up, we have velocity, which uses your MIDI controller's velocity settings. This also works with velocity tracking as well. Right now it's not enabled because I do not have a MIDI controller connected. You have lift, which works in the same principle. You have octave note, which works based off whatever octave you're playing. So we'll assign that here. So it's basically the same thing as note tracking, except it's within a certain octave. So it'll reset. Pressure and slide take control of Vital supporting MPE, which you can enable in the Advanced tab by clicking on here. Now, I do not have an MPE controller. However, if you want to see somebody use an MPE controller with Vital, I would highly recommend checking out Venus Theory's video on Vital. Next up here, you have the stereo modulator, which allows you to modulate any parameter here without using the LFO as splitting it into a stereo field. So what you can do here is I can put this on the wavetable thing. Let's make this a bipolar modulation. So we'll set that right in the middle, and I'll put that there. So what this allows me to do is it allows me to control the bipolar modulation with something like an LFO, not an LFO, an envelope. And I'll turn note track back on. So that's pretty cool. And next up, we have random, which chooses a random value every time you hit a note. Fun if you want to, if it's pretty cool if you want to have, you know, just random values every time you hit a note. Next up, we move up, we have the LFO box. You have 8 in total, so if we just modulate a bunch of other stuff, and you'll see more LFO boxes appear, up to a total of 8. You can double-click these modulation wheels to remove the modulation, which is pretty cool. And yeah. So we'll go over LFO 1. We're going to modulate the wavetable, the wavetable frame selector. So that in Vital is a slider. I'll go over that in a second. As you can see, the LFO is motion blurred, so you can see where it's at, where it states at. You have 6 different types, so you have sync, which will sync it to the BPM of your host device or your DAW. As you do that. Envelope makes the LFO act like an envelope, so you can have more than just 6 envelopes here. And what this also allows you to do is it allows you to have any sort of LFO shape, like, you know, you can do some weird stuff like this, and you can have this act as an envelope. So pretty powerful. Let's go back to the basic, the basic triangle thing, if I can find it. We'll actually search for it. There it is. So that acts like an envelope. Sustain envelope works off of envelope's one sustain amount. That actually works off of release, doesn't it? Yeah, it works off of release, so. Alright, and let's put that back at default. Pretty cool. Next up is loop point, which takes control of this thing. So you can do some pretty powerful stuff with this, so I'm going to actually modulate this. So I'm going to modulate this thing. So yeah, so we're going to modulate that with the envelope too, so. So we'll put that out further out. And you also have loop hold, which is the opposite. Pretty cool. We can modulate these to cut them off by default, and let's search up triangle again. And boom, we have that. So that's what this thing does. So if we go to trigger, that's where we'll default trigger. So that goes over your modes. The frequency, it's the same thing as you would find in your random LFOs. Here you have smooth, so let's put this on the frame. This controls how smooth the note is. You also have fade in. Pretty cool. By default, it's set to smooth, so that's the default value. And what this allows you to do is for things like if I want to make a quantized, you know, sample and hold like sequence, so something like that. That's what it sounds like with no smoothness. Here's what it sounds like if I add some smooth to it. Pretty powerful. You also have delay, which will delay the LFO up to 4 seconds. Pretty cool. And we can also split it into stereo. Which by default will offset it. Pretty cool. So we'll go back to triangle. And I will now showcase the paint tool. So you have a total of 5 different options. You have triangles, so you can do this. What the paint tool does is it will snap to the XY grid, which compared to something like Serum, the X and Y controls here are independent, and your LFOs will automatically snap to it. We'll turn this down to something more reasonable. So we have that. We also have up. We have down. Pretty cool. We have half. If you want to make a gated sequence to something like that, and you also have full. So what you can do with this is if I'm going to crank it up to 32, and we'll just do a bunch of that stuff. If I want to make that, you know, have some other stuff with it, so you want to make it go stupid. And apparently it's now being weird. I think that might be a limitation in terms of how many points you can add to an LFO. Apparently not. I can just keep on adding more. So now if that's gotten out of hand, let's go back to our original triangle thing, and let's crank that down to something more reasonable. So we'll crank it down to 8 to 1. This changes the type of thing that these LFO points do, so it changes how the intensity of how they slope. So by default, it's like this. This allows you to turn a triangle wave into a sine. And next, right over here, that's going to be your LFO selector. You can just, you know, select these with the, you know, arrows. Pretty cool. And you also have an LFO selector that's very similar to your wavetable selector, which I'll go over in a second. Before we go over that, let's change this back to default. So triangle, we're going to keep our FM growl as an example, and we're going to move over to the envelope section. So by default, envelope 1 is going to be your amplitude envelope. And that's going to be where your control for your sustain envelope is going to be. That's going to be the release. So this has delay, attack, this is delay, attack, hold, sustain, decay, sustain, and release. You can use this magnifying glass to draw it out. And all these knobs, you can just double click to reset them. The other envelopes, which you have a total of 6 of, these are just generic envelopes that you can use to control parameters that require, you know, one shot. So if I want to control something like the wavetable, which I will do by here. We got to say what's that. And what I did there is I switched the Spectral Knob to vocoder, which I'll go over what that does in a second because it's pretty cool. Let's reset all that to our defaults. And next thing, we're going to go over the top panel. So I'm going to have an LFO modulate the growl. So as you can see right over here, this is your view thing. This contains an oscilloscope and a frequency histogram. These are both built right into Vital, which is very similar to how FL Studio handles it. But what I find this being nice for is if you're either A, using Vital in standalone, or B, if you're using it in a DAW that doesn't have one of these things like out of the box. And I think these are just pretty cool. Not only just to look at, but also to have like built right in, so you can see, you know, if you're imposing any sort of, you know, DC offset, which is really nice, especially built right into a synth too. Next up, we have your volume mixer. This is where you can check to see if your patch is redlining. You can also just control volume. And yes, you can modulate this too. If you want a basic sidechain, you can do it right there. Next, you have the Hamburger Menu, which allows you to browse your presets, which will just take you to the preset browser. You can save a preset, which will just take you to the Save Preset option, which is also the option right next to the Hamburger Menu. You can upload an external preset. You can export the preset. You can import a preset bank, and you can export a preset bank. This is where you'll also find your option to initialize the preset, load a tuning file, and log out of your email, which is handled for things like the built-in store, which I have no idea what it looks like yet because I'm filming this before release. Fun! Next up here, you have your preset save thing. So that's where you'll save your presets. It's where you can type in a name, the author, the style of the patch, and you can add in any comments. Pretty cool. Next up, you have the preset browser, which is pretty basic and pretty cool. You have your preset name, the author. You can also search for presets. So if I want to search up, I can type in ARP, and just give it a second because my library is massive, and boom. This is where you'll find the title and the author of the patch. We're going to initialize it as well. So we're going to init. And here you can search between basses, leads, keys, sequences, and here you also have a file structure. So here I can go look through my preset bank here, and I can find some stuff. And you'll find most of these patches in a bank that I'm going to release for this video sometime soon. I'm going to be releasing patches that I know are probably not going to be in the factory content. And once I can confirm that a selection of patches that aren't in factory content, I'll just put those with the preset bank here. I'll let you guys know, and that's updated through my Twitter, which you can follow right in the description. It is Horizon95. I'll leave a link to that in the description. And also down in the description, you'll find my Twitch, which is where I stream. I'll probably be streaming some instances where I just make patches with Vital, and I'll probably be also streaming some interesting scenarios where you guys in the chat tell me what to do, which I think will be pretty fun. Anyways, going back to the review, next up we have, right over here, you have the 4 different tabs, which is basically the same as you would find in Serum. So you have your voices, your effects, your matrix, and the advanced tab. Pretty cool. Next up, you have the Vital logo, which will bring up, basic menu, the overarching menu. You have the Vital logo, you got Vital, you have your version number. You can check for updates. I have no idea what that does, but it checks for updates. You have your size things, so if Vital's a bit too big, you can just select it right here. You can select, and in standalone, you can select your audio device type and output. You can play a test tone. You can change the sample rate, audio buffer size, and any MIDI input, so you can connect a MIDI controller into standalone and play it through that. In a DAW, all you'll get is just check for updates and your size button, because most of this stuff you'll have handled through your DAW. Next up, going on the left side, you have 4 macros, which you can assign the same way as you would modulation. You can also rename them by clicking the pencil icon here. And you also have assignable mod boxes, which is what I'm going to call them, for pitch wheel and mod wheel. So if I want to control panning through pitch wheel, let's make that by bipolar modulation. Well, I don't necessarily see it as being something that could be used in most patches. because you can control the amount of pitch bending with the bend thing over here, I feel like that this could be useful for bipolar modulation. If you want to, let's say, use a spectral knob that can go both ways, and you want to modulate with pitch wheel, which I think is pretty cool. And speaking of that, we're going to go over the oscillators. So over here, you have in Vital, you have a total of 3 oscillators, a sampler, and 2 filters. So first things first, we're going to go over the oscillator controls and how it's laid out. And we're going to go over from left to right. So first thing here, you have the enable and disable button. That's going to be the same thing for the sampler, the filters, and also the effects, which we'll go over separately. Up in the top left corner, you have your pitch controls. So in Serum, you have 4 total, being your octave, transpose, you have tuning, and coarse tuning. In Vital, all you have is transpose, up to 4 octaves up and down. And you also have your fine tuning, which I find this to be a much nicer solution, as you're just condensing all that into just one thing. In the middle here, you have transpose snap. So by default, it is relative. So if I play a C, so let's actually put this on an LFO. Let's change it to 12, so it'll only go 1 octave. And let's actually make this 24, because 24 is an entire octave, I think. So that is relative. So if I play a C, it's going to play that. If I play an E, and I think this is probably going to be best understood if I do C major scale. So 1, 2, 3. We'll play 7th as well. Now if I play a D, an E, that's all relative. If I want to change it so it only plays these notes, I can click Global Snap, and it'll only play those notes. Now that's pretty useful if you want to go and start if you want to make any sequencer patches, which is kind of necessary. So, next up, if we go below that, you have your level and pad controls. And let's actually remove that modulation. Pretty cool. And below that, you have where you want to route that oscillator. So I can route it to filter 1, filter 2, both filters. I can skip the filters and go right to the effects chain, or I can also route it direct out. Right now, we're going to leave it to filter 1. And I'll go over something else which relates to the filters in a second. Moving over to the right, you have your wavetable selection thing. So I'm going to reopen that Citrus FM growl right here. We're going to change that to 2 octaves down. So we're going to go over how all this works. If you click on up here, this is going to bring up your wavetable menu, and which allows you to search through your favorites. You can favorite wavetables here if you frequently use them. So if I want to do something, which I'm actually going to do right now, you have a search thing. I want to save basic shapes. So let's say I want to favorite that because I like to use that option. We're going to search up basic shapes, and we're going to favorite that. So then that'll appear under my favorites, which I think is pretty useful. So what you can also do, you can add a folder, which allows you to add things like Serum wavetables. So if you already have another folder structure for, like, let's say Serum wavetables, you can just add that right to Vital, and it will be right there. So let's go back to that FM growl. You can also drag and drop audio files right into Vital. So if you have wavetables in the .wav format, you can just drag them right in, and you'll see an option for wavetable come up. You can also do pitch splice and vocode, which are options right in here. That's going to be under your phase style. So you'll see vocode here. So. Now this is useful for text to wavetable, which I'll go over in a second. So, also you have, if you look in the bottom left corner, you have the type of view that's shown inside the oscillator box. So you can switch from 2D, and let's actually add an LFO here. You can go right from 2D. You can also have a 3D view. And you also have whatever this is. I think it's a sound profile. It's pretty unique. If you look over here, you have the Wavetable Editor, which is in a keyframe style. So you have, this is running off of an audio file source. You have all fun options here. You can add in things like frequency filters. You can double click to add one. And we'll turn the cutoff and shape up, and we'll take this, and we'll just crank the cutoff and shape down. So it's kind of like a filter. Let's also add a wave folder, and we'll just crank it. We'll crank it all the way up, and pretty cool. But let's say I don't want that stuff, and I actually want to go back. Well, because this is a non-destructive form of editing, so we can just double-click these keyframes, and we're going to remove that type of mod. We're going to remove all that. Now we're back to our original waveform, which is pretty cool. Now, for sources, you have 3 different types. You have wave sources. So let's go back to the beginning. This is probably a visual bug in which you cannot see the grid, but there is a grid here. I don't know why you can't see that. That's interesting. That's something I'm probably going to have to bring up with Matt eventually. Say, hey, that's a bug. You also have a line source as well. And, of course, the grid appears right there. That's interesting. Yeah, so here you have a grid that you can snap different things to, up to 16 by 16, which is pretty cool. And as I said, it's also non-destructive, so we can also move the group. We can also move source up and down. We can also remove it if we want to. This is your, that's going to be the Wavetable selector, so you can play right through it. Pretty cool. And up here, you have, in the Hamburger menu, you have options to save it as a wavetable, which will save it as a vital table, which is a kind of proprietary, like, format-ish. You can import wavetables, you can export wavetables, you can export it to a wave, and you can also synthesize the preset to wavetable, which you can also do by clicking Resynthesize Preset to Wavetable. This is where also text to wavetable shows up. So let's add in a text box. Text for TTWT. You can also change it to different accents. We'll change it to English US.
Text for TTWT. Text for TTWT.
Pretty cool. Let's go back to the FM growl. Yeah. And let's go over everything on the right side. So over here, you have your unison controls. Pretty basic, from 1 voice to 16 voices. You can control the detune power. You can also control the unison detune amount. Over here, you have phase. So if you want to do some funny stuff, you can do this. That's pretty fun. And over here, you have the phase randomization. Now, next up, if we go below here, this is going to be your wave warping mod. So we're going to init the wavetable. And let's remove this modulation here. We'll go to a 2D view. So this is just classic wave warping. You have your format. So if you use how Serum does its wave warping, this should be pretty similar. Quantize. Bend. And I'm actually going to pull up basic shapes for this. So we're going to go into our favorites. Boom, basic shapes. There's your bending, you have squeeze. You have pulse. And then you also have your FM options. So we'll put that at none. Now, next up we're going to go over the Spectral Knob. And I think the best way to go over what this does is to look at a spectrogram. So I'm going to pull one up right over here. There it is. All right, this is what it does. So what the Spectral Knob does is it does spectral morphing on the. It does a lot of different stuff on the harmonic content of it, the spectral content of it. So what this allows you to do is it allows you to make some pretty interesting sounds. So harmonic stretch. Cool. You have inharmonic stretch. Which I find pretty useful for making bell-like sounds. You have smear. You have random amp. And we'll actually pull this back up. Once you go back. Random amp. Pretty cool. You also have low pass. You also have a high pass. You have phase disperse. That does weird stuff. You have shepherd tone. We'll put an LFO onto that. Pretty cool. And then next up you have time skew. Which is pretty cool. So that covers the oscillator section. Next up, let's go over the filters. So up here you have your filter to enable them. Your main controls are going to be these three sliders, so you have options to blend the filters. You have your filter blending, so you can control it from a low pass, to band pass, to high pass, which can be automated here. You have your filter resonance. And then you also have your filter cutoff right here. I find this a lot easier to use compared to like cutoff knobs, because if I modulate it, which I'll do right here. Another cool thing with Vital actually with modulation, while I'm still holding it, I can press a note, and I can use my scroll wheel to preview it. And with that, that'll show you where the filter goes. Pretty cool. Next up, you have your filter routing options, which are also displayed here. So I have oscillator 1 and 2. Oscillator 1 is being routed through filter 1, but oscillator 2 is being routed through filter 2, which is not enabled right now. So if we want to route it through filter 2, we can just enable it right here. What we can also do though is we can route these filters in series. So oscillators 1 and 2 will go through filter 1, and then the output of filter 1 will go into filter 2. So pretty cool. Next up, you have your filter drive, filter mix, and you also have key tracking, which will key track the filter. Pretty cool, pretty cool. Next up, you have the sampler. So we're gonna go. So this has the same pitch, routing, and level and pad controls as the oscillators do. You can also add a sample folder if you want. So you can, if you have a big fat sample library of just some fun stuff, you can add that right in by using the Add Folder button. You can also favorite certain samples if you want to. Let's select a piano to go over what this does. So we're gonna go over these 4 boxes right here and what these do. So bottom left, the one that's selected will loop the sample. So as you can see here, this little thing will show you where the sample's played at. And as you can see, that's how it does. So, we'll select this one. This will bounce the sample. I'll make it go back. Pretty cool. This button up here, the piano, will key track it. And this button here will randomize the start. As you can see here, it's shown where the starting position is different. It's shown right here on this little display. And I think that about covers that. So, next up, let's init the patch, actually. And let's go over the effects. So, just a general rule of thumb with effects, you can reroute them by doing this. Naturally, it'll go from top to bottom. If you want to, let's say, put the compressor before the chorus, you can do that. Or the other way around. Pretty cool. So let's go over the individual effects and what they sound like. Each effects have a little display thing showing you what they do. Now, I'm not going to go over every single FX module individually because we're already at like 38 minutes, at least just in this recording alone of explaining what the synth does. So we're going to make this relatively quickly. So that's the chorus. Next up, you have the compressor, which is kind of like an OTT. Change from multiband to low band to high band, and then single band as well. I think most people will keep it at the OTT. You have a delay. Has 4 different modes. It also has frequency thing. You have distortion. Not a lot of distortion modes right now. However, I believe this will be... Hopefully there should be more added later on. Pretty cool. You have an EQ, which acts like a regular old 3-band EQ. You can shelf certain things. What you can also do is you can just have a low cut, high cut, and a mid cut. Pretty cool, pretty cool. Next up, you have your filter. You have another filter. So if you want to run effects and then run a filter through that, you have a flanger, which gives you a nice visual readout of what the thing does, which I think is really useful. Same thing with the phaser. And you also have a very slick, very nice, very good sounding reverb. You can also cut out certain frequencies. So if I want to cut out all the low end on the reverb and just leave the high end, or if I want to have all in, or if I just want to cut out all this, if I want to cut out all the high end, keep the bass. Pretty cool. So we can do that. You can also disable these effects by just clicking over here. If you want to remove them, you can just click the button over here. Very cool. Next up, we're going to add some modulation. So I am going to bring back the FM growl, and I'm going to show you what the modulation matrix does, which is pretty cool. It's not a modulation. Oh, it's called a modulation matrix. So let's attach LFO 1 to that, and let's also attach LFO 2. We're going to attach it to the spectral morph. So we're going to do harmonic stretch. You can also use your mouse wheel on these to affect the thing, which I think is pretty cool. So if I want to, like, change the transposition instead of clicking and dragging, I can just do one of these. You can also right-click, set the default value. Pretty cool. So in the mod matrix, any modulation that you do with these will automatically apply to the modulation matrix. So we're actually going to bypass this right here, and I'm going to show you what these do. So this is where all your controls are. This is to make it bipolar. And all these controls you can get by just right-clicking on the modulation wheel. You can choose to stereo effect it. You can also morph how that modulation thing does. However, you also have that kind of option in modulation remap, which is really powerful, and you can have a lot of fun with it. It acts like an LFO, which is pretty cool. Let's put it back to a default, so we're going to do saw down. So this is stupidly powerful, and you can do a lot of fun stuff with it. So if I want to make some basic modulation, let's make that have none, and we'll make that have none, and we'll set that to default. So if I want to add modulation, so let's say I want to add envelope, let's add envelope 2 actually, and we're going to make it go to oscillator 1, and let's make it do the pan. So we have that. We can change the amount, which will change the amount as you can see on that little mod dial right up there. Very cool. And next up, we'll init the patch to show you the advanced tab. We'll crank up the unison to 60 and crank the detune power to 0 to show you the different kinds of unison stacking options that you have here. So you have your regular unison, power chord, and you have harmonics and odd harmonics. You can mess around with these and have a lot of fun. You also have the detune range, pretty cool. You have your options for note tracking, and hires wavetable, which I have no idea what does. So And then you have all of these fun options, which I have no idea what they do, so I'm not going to bother going into them. Over here, you have your voice options. You have your no priority voice override. You have your tuning, so you can load up a tuning file if you want to do some really funky stuff. You can enable MPE, and you also have your master controls for tuning and transposition. And you have your oversample controls. You can choose between displaying your frequency units in hertz or semitones. And you also have a larger view of the oscilloscope and the frequency histogram. And that just about covers everything. Yeah, so that should cover about pretty much everything I have. And so right about now, we're going to be going into the full-blown my opinions on Vital piece. Oh god, this is going to be interesting. I should probably get the statement out of the way, which is the fact that I have a heavy bias in Vital's favor, and I assume that's most likely because of my experience with Vital. However, I do believe that experience has given me some insight into the first-time experience, which in my opinion is the most important factor when you're testing out something for the first time. If you can get a first-time experience right, that's a potential customer. Now, for a synth to become a keeper in my book, there are 3 things it needs to get right, and that would be the UI, ease of use, and the first-time experience. First, let's go over the UI, which is so good it's not even funny. Because Vital's vectorial, you can rescale to your heart's content, and there's also the fact that the UI just looks good. When I first opened Vital up, its flat look gave me citrus vibes, and I am extremely okay with that, as both synths excel in the UI department. They look good without being distracting. Next big thing is ease of use. For me, when I first opened up Vital, I was able to poke around and find out the basics of how sounds are generated in Vital. It's a synth that took me about 30 minutes to an hour to get the basics down if you're coming at it with no prior experience, which I was. In a synth, you should be able to look at it and tell yourself, okay, this knob controls this parameter, and while synths like Harmless in this instance are fairly easy to use once you get the hang of it, for me it was fairly difficult to find out what everything does, which made me look at Harmless and say, wow, that looks complicated. Which brings me on to my last point, and that's the first-time experience. I've made it clear by now that the first-time experience is the most important part of a synth, and Vital does that really well. Those previous 2 points are big indicators if your product nails the first-time experience. At its core, there are 3 principles I work with when determining if a synth nails the first-time experience, and that's UI, ease of use, and sound quality. For any synth to get the first-time experience right, it needs to nail all 3 principles. And Vital is one of the only synths that I've seen that completely nails all 3 of these categories. It nails the UI by being flat and modern without being distracting. It is stupidly easy to work with, and it's never frustrated me with the way that it does certain things. And it sounds so good to the point where somebody in the Vital Discord server ran some tests and found out that Serum has more aliasing than Vital. But what does this mean in overall? Let's get to the last point. If you have a look at Vital and its interface compared to Serum, you might be mistaken into thinking that Vital will be a Serum killer. And while I think that Vital will be able to replace Serum in some instances, both synths have their own features that make them unique. Serum allows you to import images as wavetables. Its Wavetable Editor is completely different from Vital's Wavetable Editor. Serum has quite a lot more filter types. It also has hyperdimension, skin support, and a massive third-party preset library. And those are the big reasons, which is why I think Serum will not be dethroned from its position on the podium. However, do keep in mind that Serum is 6 years old, and Vital's brand spanking new. And I think because of that fact that the synth itself is free, you'll end up having more opportunity to have a massive install base, which would make more sound designers want to do sound design for Vital, because they can reach a much greater audience for that. If Vital has a much higher install base, that means that's more sound banks and more preset libraries that people can sell. And I think that is where Vital's going to be groundbreaking, which is the pricing tiers. For the amount of synthesizers you're getting, the fact that there's a free tier, I honestly think should be heavily commended. But besides that, and all that fun stuff that I mentioned, I personally think Vital will be able to coexist with Serum, while also offering some new party tricks. Its similarities to Serum make it so that regular Serum users should feel right at home with Vital, and that's something that's very important to me, the feeling of being right at home. I remember the first time I opened Vital, it was my first experience with not only wavetable synthesis, but it was also my first experience with a complex synthesizer. I had very little knowledge on what things did. I mean, hell, I was only somewhat aware of what LFOs are. And even with my basic knowledge on synthesis, I was still able to have fun with Vital. It's the perfect synth to introduce yourself to synthesis. It's the synth that holds your hand as you're learning, but also sticks around as you grow up. As you grow up and learn new things, Vital will still be waiting there to have some fun. And while I do enjoy using synths such as Harmless, Citrus, Flux, and even Surge, at the end of the day, I always come back to Vital, because for me, Vital is my home. And who knows, maybe it will become your home too. Thanks for watching. See you next time.